Hello, everyone. I'd like to make a video about the Week 9 study questions. These are obviously open-ended questions, really asking for your opinion about things, but as always, that opinion should be grounded in some knowledge of the case. Number one, if as an engineer, you observe a possible safety hazard to the public at a work site, but you have no professional connection to the project, do you have a responsibility to do anything? Why or why not? Of course, this refers to one of the cases we read having to do with just that. An engineer who is working on a particular site notices a possible safety hazard at an adjoining site. Does that engineer have any responsibility to do anything? There is no obviously correct answer to this. It has to be an open-ended question. And it has to be an open-ended question because it is your answer to this question is determined by your interpretation of the first canon. And the BER gives a certain answer. Essentially, their answer is no. The engineer has no responsibility to do anything. There is some slight suggestion here that the engineer should inform their employer or the client, but that's really a secondary matter. Essentially, what they've said is that the engineer has no responsibility to address the problem, to protect the public in this case. And it is a valid interpretation of first canon, and the reasons that they give for their interpretations are, I think, credible. That essentially what I interpret that case as saying is that you have to draw a line. You have to set a limit, more precisely, in what responsibilities an engineer has to the public at large. Because if you don't, you're going to fall down a slippery slope in which the engineer has to take responsibility for anything that they might come across in the course of their day. Safety hazards, possible threats to the public. The truth of the matter is that an engineer, trained engineer, despite whatever their specialty may be, is just going to be have the ability to spot things that the ordinary person doesn't in terms of them being possible safety hazards, and to say that they have a responsibility to do something about everything that they see would be unreasonable. It would, I think the key claim is that it would place an unreasonable burden on the engineer. That is one interpretation of the first canon. That is that line needs to be drawn somewhere, and that they've drawn it there. Of course, you have to acknowledge, or I have to acknowledge, that one of the things about that case is that it's a possible safety hazard. It is not an imminent hazard, but I don't know how you determine something like that. I think despite that, the line has been drawn. That is that the engineer has no responsibility for a project that may present a safety hazard to the public, unless they have some professional connection to the project, and then it becomes a matter of then they have an ethical responsibility. That is one interpretation of the first canon. But if we read the first canon, if we just look at it, there is no such limiting. There are no limiting conditions that are actually built into the canon. I mean, that's what the BER is for, is to interpret these things. But a straight reading of the canon does not indicate any kind of limits. So it is simply an interpretation. I think another interpretation would be, well, the first canon says that you must hold paramount, put first the health, safety, and welfare of the public. A possible safety hazard, no matter where it is, whether it's at a site that you are professionally connected to or not, is a danger to the health, safety, and welfare of the public. You, as the person with special knowledge and skills, have a responsibility to protect the public. That would mean that if you see something in the course of your everyday life, even your work life, but is not connected to something that you are a project that you are actually professionally connected to, that would mean that you do have a responsibility to do something about it. Now, one could argue I think, credibly, that the slippery slope argument is fallacious. That is, one could argue that the BER is exaggerating the burden that would result from a more liberal, open interpretation of the first canon. That is, that it would not be a runaway train. Engineers do not come across possible safety hazards to the public all day long, every day. That's an exaggeration. No, I don't know if that's true, but I think it certainly has some legs. So there is no one answer to this. It really depends upon your interpretation of the first canon, and perhaps it's true that a line needs to be drawn, no matter what your interpretation is. That is, a limit has to be put on that responsibility. But some people would argue that that limit is put too stringently by the BER in this case. Number two, in BER 97-12, the engineer who called the hotline was judged to be acting unethically. Did the BER judge rightly? Why or why not? I think this is a very interesting case. And most of the classroom discussion board discussion really does back up the BER's judgment that the engineer overreacted in this case, acted wrongly. And I think that's because most people regard software piracy as a very petty thing, if they a petty infraction if they regard it to be an infraction at all. And that really, is a matter of judgment. I think anybody who takes it more seriously will think that the engineer is in a much more difficult position than that in terms of loyalty to employer and doing what's right. But again, that's a matter of judgment. What's key to this case, I suppose, for the BER is that we're not talking about a case involving, it's not really a first canon case. It's a fourth canon case, but not a first canon case. That is, there's no danger to the public here. We're talking about basically economic malfeasance or theft. It's theft, is what it is. It's petty theft, or maybe not so petty theft, but the engineer is in a position where they are aware that their employer has stolen something from a business partner. That's how I would put it in terms of software piracy. It's a form of theft. And it may not be all that important. It may be quite common, but it's still theft. And then the engineer has to decide what to do. The BER pretty much, I think, leans heavily on the fact that it's not a danger to the public, and therefore the engineer really doesn't have the kind of ethical responsibility to fix the problem that they would if it were a danger to the public. On the other hand, the engineer is not just an engineer, they're a professional. Professionals have certain ethical standards which may be higher than others. If you're a cashier at 7-Eleven and you become aware that the software that runs your cash register has been stolen by your employer, I don't think you're under any ethical responsibility to report 7-Eleven to a hotline. But if you're a professional and you're being asked to use a tool, and that's what the CAD software is, it's a tool that you need to do your job, and you are aware that that tool is stolen, I think it's a different thing altogether. That is, it's a serious matter. It may not be and again, it's a matter of judgment. It may not be the biggest infraction in the world in terms of being a theft of property, but I would see it more in the case of you as a professional are being told by your employer to use tools to do your job, which you know to have been stolen. And that may put it in a different light. Now, does that justify the engineer in calling the hotline? Well, what other course of action is open to them? Confronting their employer is one. Refusal to use the workstation unless the software there has been paid for would be another. And probably, in my mind, better. But realistically, that's putting yourself at risk. That engineer would be putting themselves at risk in some way or another, potentially damaging their career, at least their employment, by alienating them from their employer. So then the question is, can you require, if the engineer does want to do something about it, can you require them to take the course of action that would be most injurious to themselves? I don't know. Did the BER judge rightly? I think that that's a judgment call. That is, if your employer has done something which you strongly believe and have evidence is unethical, then what are your duties to your employer in that case? Does calling the hotline constitute harming your employer? Well, if your employer has done something that is unethical or illegal in this case, then one might argue that they've put themselves in that position. You haven't. And if they hadn't done that, a call to a hotline would be harmless because it would be found that nothing unethical or illegal had been done. So there's no one way to answer this, but there are several ways to answer it. But it would seem to me to rely upon a judgment on a number of factors.